Hello, I'm Heather Parry, and I'm speaking from my incredibly pink room in Glasgow today. And I'm thrilled to be joined by an incredible group of women this evening to talk about Charco Press's newest release, the fantastic and gorgeous Havana Year Zero by Karla Suárez, translated by Christina MacSweeney. I'm just going to take a moment for the cover because, like all of Charco's books, it is just beautiful and an item to hold on the lonely nights when we're all in lockdown. Today's event is going to be made up of a few different parts. In a moment, I'm going to invite Charco Press's head honcho, Carolina, to say a few words about this fantastic novel, and to then introduce us to the writer and translator, Karla and Christina. We're going to have a reading from the novel in Spanish, and then we're going to have the translation in English. And then I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Helen Yaffe and Parvathi Kumaraswami, two brilliant Cubanists, and we're going to have a little bit of a chat around the context of the book, what we might pull from the meaning and things like this. Then, of course, we're going to have time for audience questions, so do get your typing fingers ready. You can put your questions into the chat at any point, and our lovely secret host, Jules, will send them through to us for the end. So don't worry if you put them in very early. We will get to them anyway. Carolina, I think I'm going to hand over to you first.
Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you, Heather, and thanks everybody for coming this evening to enjoy with us the launch of this very special book by Karla Suárez, who's our very first Cuban author for Charco Press. We're delighted to be publishing Karla, who has a great trajectory. She's published 4 novels. This is her 3rd one, and several collections of short stories and a few books of travel writing. And we're here today to welcome her to the Charco Press family with Christina MacSweeney, who is part of the family already. She's translated Daniel Saldana Paris for us already, Ramifications, which you might have read. And she's also translated Valeria Luiselli and Juliette Herbert, and she's a very experienced translator. So I could not be happier to have this amazing team of very knowledgeable and talented women today to talk about Karla's book. As Heather said, we're going to have Helen Yaffe and Parvathi Kumaraswami later on talking about Cuba and how this book fits into Cuban cultural context. So I'm going to leave you with the wonderful reading from Karla and Christina, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. Thank you. Have we lost people?
A ver si quiere empezar Karla.
Aquí sí, empiezo Bueno, buenas tardes. Primero, un saludito. Gracias a todos por estar aquí y gracias Cristina y Carolina. Ya luego hablaremos. Empiezo entonces
Karla, would just like to say thank you to everybody and thank you for coming here. Thank you to Carolina and to me. Thank you, Karla.
Es el inicio de la novela. Todo ocurrió en 1993, año cero en Cuba, el año de los apagones interminables, cuando La Habana se llenó de bicicletas y las despensas se quedaron vacías. No había nada, cero transporte, cero carne, cero esperanza. Yo tenía 30 años y miles de problemas, por eso me fui enredando. Aunque al principio ni siquiera sospechaba que para los otros las cosas habían comenzado mucho antes, en abril de 1989. Cuando el periódico Gramma publicó un artículo titulado El teléfono se inventó en Cuba, que hablaba del italiano Antonio Meucci. La mayoría de la gente habrá olvidado poco a poco aquella historia. Sin embargo, ellos recortaron el artículo y lo guardaron. Yo no lo leí. Por eso, en 1993 aún no sabía nada del asunto, hasta que casi sin darme cuenta me convertí en una de ellos. Es inevitable. Soy licenciada en matemática y a mi profesión le debo el método y el razonamiento lógico. Sé que hay fenómenos que solo pueden ocurrir cuando determinados factores se reúnen. Y ese año estábamos tan jodidos que fuimos a converger hacia un único punto. Éramos variables de la misma ecuación. Una ecuación que quedaría sin resolver hasta muchos años ya después. Ya sin nosotros, claro. Para mí todo empezó en casa de un amigo que digamos se llama Euclides. Sí, prefiero ocultar los verdaderos nombres de los implicados para no herir sensibilidades, ¿de acuerdo? Euclides es entonces la primera variable de esta maldita ecuación. Aquella tarde, recuerdo que llegamos a su casa y la vieja nos recibió con la noticia de que otra vez se había roto el motor del agua y tocaba cargar cubos para rellenar los tanques. Mi amigo hizo un gesto de desgano y yo me ofrecí a ayudar. En eso andábamos cuando me acordé de la conversación que había tenido lugar durante una cena a la que yo había asistido días atrás y le pregunté si había oído hablar de un tal Meucci. Euclides apoyó su cubo en el piso y me miró preguntando, ¿Antonio Meucci? Sí, evidentemente ya había escuchado ese nombre. Agarró mi cubo, echó el agua en el tanque e informó a su madre que luego continuaría porque estaba cansado. La vieja protestó, pero Euclides ni le hizo caso. Me tomó por el brazo para conducirme al cuarto, encendió el radio, como cada vez que no quería ser escuchado, y sintonizó CMBF, la emisora de música clásica. Entonces me pidió que le contara. Le dije lo poco que sabía y agregué que todo había empezado porque el escritor estaba escribiendo un libro sobre Meucci. ¿Un escritor? ¿Qué escritor? Preguntó muy serio y ahí me molesté, porque ¿a qué venían todas estas preguntas? Euclides se levantó y fue a buscar algo en el armario. Regresó con una carpeta para sentarse otra vez junto a mí en la cama. Hace años que estoy interesado en esta historia, dijo.
It all happened in 1993, Year Zero in Cuba, the year of interminable power cuts, when bicycles filled the streets of Havana and the shops were empty. There was nothing of anything. Zero transport, zero meat, zero hope. I was 30 and had thousands of problems. That's why I got involved, although in the beginning I didn't even suspect that, for the others, things had started much earlier, in April 1989, when the newspaper Granma published an article about an Italian man called Antonio Meucci, under the headline, "The telephone was invented in Cuba." That story had gradually faded from most people's minds. They, however, had cut out the piece and kept it. I didn't read it at the time, which is why in 1993 I knew nothing about the whole affair until I somehow became one of them. It was inevitable. I'm a mathematician. Method and logical reasoning are part and parcel of my profession. I know that certain phenomena can only manifest themselves when a given number of factors come into play. And so we were fucked in 1993, that we were converging on a single point. We were variables in the same equation, an equation that wouldn't be solved for many years, without our help, naturally. For me, it all began in a friend's apartment. Let's call him Euclid. Yes, if it's all right with you, I'd prefer not to use the real names of the people involved. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. So Euclid is the first variable in that damned equation. I remember that when we arrived at his place, his mum greeted us with the news that the pump had broken down again and we'd have to fill the storage drums using buckets of water. My friend scowled. I offered to help. So that's what we were doing when I recalled a conversation that had taken place during a dinner a few days before. And I asked him if he'd ever heard of someone called Meucci. Euclid put down his bucket, looked at me, and asked if I meant Antonio Meucci. Yes, of course he knew the name. He grabbed my bucket, poured the water into the drum, and informed his mother that he was tired and would finish the task later. She protested, but Euclid turned a deaf ear. He took my arm and led me to his room, switched on the radio, his usual practice when he didn't want to be overheard, and tuned into CMBF, the classical music station. Then he asked for the full story. I told him what little I knew and added that it had all started because the author was writing a book about Meucci. An author? What author? He asked gravely. And that irritated me because I didn't see the need for so many questions. Euclid got to his feet, went over to the wardrobe, and returned with a folder. He sat down next to me on the bed and said, I've been interested in this story for years. Finished.
I'm there. Hello. Thank you so much, Karla. Thank you so much, Christina. They were fantastic readings. It's always so good to hear it in both languages. And if anyone can speak both, what a treat, because you can feel the subtle differences in context. And yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Helen and Par to join me on video as well and unmute themselves now. So we're going to have a little chat around the context of this period. I mean, they're both so brilliant at what they do. I'll give you a little introduction for them both. Dr. Parvathi Kumaraswami is a Cubanist specializing in Cuban cultural policy and practice from 1959 to the present. That's quite a period, especially in relation to literature. Helen Yaffe is a lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow and the author of We Are Cuba. Her teaching focuses on Latin American and Cuban development. And I have to give a shout out for We Are Cuba, which I'm reading right now. And I'm turning every page, I'm turning the page to remember to come back to it later because there's so much. So as we heard from Karla and Christina, this novel is set in 1993 at the height of what's known as the special period. Helen, can you start us out by explaining for anyone who's unaware what the special period was and how it came about?
Okay, so thanks for the free plug for the book. The second part of the title is How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. So this special period is a big issue in the book. And what the special period is basically the period of economic crisis that hits Cuba when it loses 86 to 87% of its imports and exports. It loses its main trading partners, and GDP collapses by 35% over 3 years. So, you know, if we're seeing economic crises now around the world, but if we think about what the kind of collapse associated with 35% fall of GDP, it was absolutely devastating. So, of course, this is not just an economic crisis. This is a social crisis as well, because the state, the Cuban state, has commitments to health, education, housing, and as Pa will tell you, you know, culture, literature, and so on. And yet its resources have been massively depleted. So the question in the special period is, how will they keep people alive, because the situation was that dire in the beginning, but how will they also then restructure the Cuban economy for what is obligatory now, reintegration into international capitalist markets, and how will they move forward with development? So that is the period. This, you know, one of the best ways to understand the special period is through the situation with oil. Okay, because oil is essential for so much. Now, before the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the Cubans were importing 13 million tons of oil from the Soviet Union every year. And this plummeted by 1991 to 1 million and then dried up completely. So the question is, how do you keep the economy and society moving? Because oil is not just used to fill up cars and buses. That's one feature of it, and hence we have this wonderful red bicycle on the front cover. The oil is used for tractors, which are, you know, essential for food production to keep people fed. Oil is used for the electricity as the just the short reading referred to the blackouts. But you know, when you have a blackout, there's no electricity. It's not just the light that goes off, the fridge goes off. So if you had preserved any of the scarce food resources in the fridge, they're now going to go off. There's no air fans in a tropical country. You have to sweat through the night with a candle. So this is the kind of context of the special period. And year zero, 1993, is when the situation hits its lowest or most difficult point. I just want to say, I think the novel is fantastic at capturing that feeling. I wasn't in Cuba in 1993, but I was in Cuba in 1995. The situation had started to improve slightly, but there was still the issue of blackouts. So, and blackouts were rationed by that point. So every neighborhood knew that, you know, for example, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the electricity would go off for 12 hours. And I experienced that. I hitched around the island when there was so little petroleum for cars, so that there was organized collective hitchhiking and so on. And I just found the novel incredibly evocative. It did a wonderful job of giving you a sense, almost a smell and a feel and a touch of what that was like, and what an extraordinary feat for the Cubans who got through it. I'll pass over to Par now.
Par, I was hoping you could give us, I should say as well, I love the cover, and I just want to give a shout out to Pablo, who does all of the Charco covers and always manages to bring the very essence of the book out just in one image, and it's such an achievement. Thank you so much, Helen. Par, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how the special period affected the arts and culture in Cuba.
Absolutely. So building on what Helen said, she's given us a really nice summary of the economic effects and some of the social effects. It was, as Karla articulates and expresses so beautifully in the novel, a sense of real paralysis, a sense of broken dreams, a sense of frustration, of kind of feeling suffocated on a social level. And that was certainly felt by the cultural sphere. And that's because from 1959, the Cuban government has worked very hard and continues to work really hard to prioritize not just education, but also culture. So when you read the novel, if you've read it already, you will find that there are many, many references to groups of writers meeting. And during the special period, they met when it was dark during the Apagón and shared tea that they could make from lemon skins or leaves or whatever was available. And that was their release, that was their space, because I guess the really important issue is that Cuba has a lot of writers. Cuba has created the conditions for a lot of writers to feel that they have a voice and to feel that they can express themselves. And Karla can talk very much about her own trajectory. I'll be fascinated to find out how she came into writing literature, because she's trained as an electrical engineer. But that story is very typical in Cuba. And it's typical in Havana, but it's typical right throughout the island, because really from the 70s onwards, they created a network of spaces to prioritize participation in culture as an amateur. So you could learn to write, you could learn to dance, you could learn to paint, you could learn to play a musical instrument. But the idea behind that, which was articulated right at the start of the revolution, was that the kind of idea of 1,000 flowers blooming. So if you create the conditions for everybody to participate on a mass scale, we will find some really first-class artists. So all of us who now know about Carlos Acosta, for example, we know that he came from that system. And you know, we may marvel, and he is a marvelous dancer, a very accomplished dancer, but he is the product of that system, which is really something. So back to your question, Heather, I could go on for hours, but back to your question. During the special period, that was a huge period of frustration for those people who'd become accustomed to not only, you know, getting on with their daily lives, but also expressing themselves culturally. Cubans have an excellent sense of humor. You will read that in Karla's novel. It's you know, there is a wit and an ability to turn difficult situations into humor. But there is a phrase, the colchón editorial, the editorial mattress, or the publishing mattress, which refers to all of the manuscripts that were left unpublished as a result of the shortage of fuel, paper, etc., etc. That colchón editorial, they're working their way through it now. Since the economy has recovered somewhat, they're working their way through it, but they will never, ever recuperate all of the manuscripts that were lost. And if that's the case for literature, that's the similar case for many, many other forms of culture, that many artists and writers felt, and some of you will know this because it's sort of one of the urban myths about Havana, certainly, felt that it was no longer possible to aspire to being a cultural figure or to make a living, certainly, from it. And many people either left the country at that time or turned to a different kind of income generation. That's quite a well-known story about Cuba. But you get the sense that for people like our protagonist in the novel and for groups around her, and especially young people, that cultural expression was just a central part of being Cuban. And that's certainly something that you can see to some extent in the present day in Cuba.
Thank you, Par. That's so fascinating about the cultural matrix. And hopefully it means we'll get many more amazing Cuban writers that Charco can then publish in English as well. Maybe Karla will be the first of many. As we've kind of touched upon, by the way, we're going to avoid spoilers in this chat. So if you haven't read the book yet, don't worry, we're not going to ruin it for you. But I did want to give a little bit of an overview. So as we've heard a little bit of, the plot of this novel follows a rumor amongst a group of people in Havana that the telephone was in fact invented in their city by an Italian inventor called Antonio Meucci. It's pointed out that there's a distinct irony in this possibility. If the telephone had been invented in a city so cut off from the rest of the world during this time where telephones even barely worked. I was wondering, Helen, if you can give us a little bit of a context for this, a little bit about the scarcity of goods and even like materials for manufacturing. Oh, we might have to wait for you to be unmuted. The joys of Zoom.
Okay, I've done it. Yes, I don't stay silenced for long. So yeah, I mean, you know, in my book, I've got a whole chapter on the special period, and I go through, you know, for those who like statistics, some people do, you know, they can think in terms of numbers, but I go through in each sector, you know, how much it was down. And basically what you can say is there was scarcity in every sector, from, you know, the capacity to build roads, repair homes, repair schools, to the capacity, as Par's saying, you know, to paper. Paper was short, so you couldn't print books. And even the daily newspaper of the Cuban Communist Party was shrunk down to 8 pages at one stage. So many of the things, so, you know, we're often told, oh, there's only one newspaper in Cuba, but actually if you see a catalogue of publications from before the special period, you can see that was also, you know, a resource constraint. So yeah, in every sector, in medicine, there were shortages. I recall going to a school during a sort of solidarity brigade with a big group of young people from Britain, and going to a school in Cuba in '95 in December. And the head teacher showed us one empty notebook and said to us, this is all we have for the entire school next term. You know, so, and that kind of thing, in the field of medicine, the Cubans worked hard to kind of compensate for the lack of equipment and medicine by increasing the number of medical professionals who were trained. So we have this, you know, going back to the sort of economic or political economy situation, we have this fascinating graph that actually, you know, again, it's a graph for those who like to read those sorts of things. It tells a massive story about how Cuba dealt with the special period, because it shows GDP falling, so GDP goes down, but it also shows at the same time what happened to employment. Now, in any country in the world, any capitalist country, when there is an economic crisis, you expect unemployment to go up. And that's what we're seeing here. But in Cuba, it went down. So the government took a decision that people should be kept at work because work has a social and political function. For a start, they would get free lunches through work, so that is another mechanism of keeping people alive. They would also be linked to their political networks and have their representation through the trade unions and so on. So it really was a time of incredible scarcity. But what is so extraordinary when you study the special period is the way the government was able to invoke community organization and to mobilize scarce resources to kind of protect the population. In the case of community organization, one of the best examples was the shift to organic farming in city gardens and urban gardens. So people started to grow fruit and veg in their own, backyard, or maybe a house had collapsed next to them and there was a sort of wasteland there, and they'd grow fruit and veg for themselves and their neighbors. And this started to, be picked up all over the place. And the governments and local authorities saw that happening and realized how useful this was in this period, and then promoted that nationwide. So this has this wonderful urban gardens and organic city farms that have taken off, and now Cuba is really leading the world.
Yeah, it feels like we've got a lot to learn. It was when you were just speaking then, I thought, it was kind of unthinkable a year ago to imagine that we might be in a similar situation of our government keeping us all in work, and yet, how so things have changed so much. Par, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Battle of Ideas, what that was, and how a rumor like the one in this book what it would mean to Cubans and their self-image. And basically, why does Julia, the narrator of this book, feel so strongly about hunting this down?
So the Battle of Ideas is all about the recovery, what Helen and I have been talking about, the recovery from that. And it was a Fidel Castro-led campaign. So, Fidel Castro, love him or hate him, but he had a real ability to think imaginatively about how Cuba might try and hold back the influence of the US in terms of national sovereignty and a sense of independence after delayed colonialism, really. But the Battle of Ideas was especially a campaign that was intended to try and reintegrate young people into the revolution. This is something that you can see certainly from Karla's wonderful novel, that young people, especially, everybody was disillusioned by the effects of the special period and their impact on daily life, but young people especially, because I guess depending on the stage we are in our lives, we can see ourselves benefiting or not from what the structures around us provide. And the Battle of Ideas, which was launched in 2000, was precisely to try and reintegrate marginalized youth. And there was some, you might say slightly crazy, but also perhaps genius solutions. So faculty, a School of Social Work, which provided a fast-track degree in social work, not for anybody, for young people from those marginalized areas who could be trained in social work, then go back to their local areas. What Helen is saying about community culture, go back to their local areas, knowing what the social problems were and try and address them. In terms of general kind of recovery, it meant also recognizing that education and culture at a local level, because of some of the scarcities and shortages and lack of infrastructure that had come in with the special period. So local activity was going to be really crucial. So in many ways, the Cuban government learned from practice. It learned from how people had themselves survived the special period. And then it implemented policies very much listening and observing, listening to and observing what the Cuban people had done in terms of local activity. And that's how Cuba recovered to some extent. I don't want to paint too harmonious a picture of it because it's been, Cuban history from 1959 has been very turbulent for a whole variety of reasons. And the Battle of Ideas is very little studied because I think it came so quickly after the special period that many people couldn't quite catch up with the, you might say, sort of future-looking, future-proofing ideas that Fidel Castro had. But what's really interesting is that when you go outside Havana, where the Battle of Ideas, there's many interpretations of it. When you go outside Havana and talk to people in other parts of Cuba, they've all benefited from the policies that were implemented by the Battle of Ideas, whether that was getting a degree from municipalized universities, or whether that was receiving the cultural, educational, or social benefits in some other way. So it is something which is neglected in terms of research, but it's a really interesting period of Cuban history. And it has been the foundation for what we see now in Cuba. Well, what we see in Cuba, which has been affected by Trump, which is now trying to recalibrate itself in the context of Biden being elected. So you can see that having a neighbor just 90 miles away, which is as powerful as the US, also has a very large part to play in Cuba's destiny.
Yeah, I've started to think about how the UK would fare if we were suddenly cut off from the EU, if the US had taken against us for, you know, one of many reasons, if we were, you know, basically set adrift from Europe as a landmass, you know, how we could, I mean, it doesn't, we would not do well, is all I can take away from that idea. But you touched on something there that actually Karla writes about in the book. She employs chaos theory as a kind of metaphor throughout as a subject. And the narrator Julia says at one point, a butterfly fluttered its wings on the other side of the Atlantic. So I want to ask about, like, does this, I suppose I'll start with Helen first and then get to you, Par, as well. Does this capture a feeling within Cuban society at that time, this kind of like sense of helplessness, but not only that circumstances were out of the control of regular people, but that to some degree they were also out of control of the ministers? Oh, Helen's muted once more. We will get her back in.
Okay, I'm not going to make the same joke about not silencing me again. Sorry, because once you said my name, I was trying to unmute, so I lost the focus of the question.
Yes, the question was about the concept of a butterfly having fluttered its wings on the other side of the Atlantic, and was there a sense at the time that Cuba was helpless, not only, you know, the people themselves, but even that the ministers didn't really have control over what was happening to Cuba because so much of it was dependent on other countries?
This is really interesting. I've just done a lecture today. I'm teaching a course on Cuban history and the Cuban Revolution, and we just did a lecture on international relations. And, you know, that is one of the features of Cuba, which will not change whether Cuba is socialist or capitalist or, you know, trading with the socialist bloc or international economy. Cuba is a small island nation, and it is dependent on foreign trade, and that will always be the case because of its resource base. And so it is susceptible to external powers. And, you know, like most of the global South, Cuba's history has been shaped by hundreds of years of colonialism and subsequently imperialism, you know, from the United States. So colonialism from Spain, imperialism from the United States. And that is the reality for most countries in the world. They are shaped by, whether you want to call them the great powers or the developed countries or the imperialist countries, they are shaped by them. What I find so fascinating about Cuba is how they have used such creativity. I mean, Par talks about the role of Fidel Castro. That is undoubtedly there, but, you know, we obviously know that one man does not build a society. And you know, why Fidel? Well, Fidel Castro himself represents, you know, a historical movement, a historical demand for independence and sovereignty. And they have showed extraordinary creativity. Really their testimony to what happens. I think, you know, when you were talking about this, educate, Par was talking about this, give people access to education, give people access to the things they need to survive and have a decent, maybe not high standard of living, certainly not consumerist. And, you know, you will find that among the population, there are many geniuses, whether that's in the arts and culture or in science, medical science, the biotechnology sector we're seeing today. Cuba has 5 candidate vaccines for COVID-19, 2 of them in phase 3 trials. That is really big deal for the global South, and so on. So the point is, I think I'm losing slightly track of the question, but the point is, yeah, Cuba is going to be, you know, the room for maneuver within Cuba is determined by external factors. But within that space that they have achieved extraordinary things in the fields of art and culture and science and technology and so on. So I love the fact that the book makes that clear. This character who's a mathematician, but you know, still is accessing culture. I think the novel really captures that, and the point about the fact that the author herself is you know, trained as an electrical engineer, and as Par says, that is not extraordinary, that is quite common. People, when you give people unlimited access to constant learning and self-improvement, they will seize that opportunity. Not everyone, of course, we can't generalize, but what you'll have is this very creative development. I mean, Cuba leading the world in sustainable development, and that's according to many scientific reports, with world leading contributions in biotechnology. There are very few comparisons that we can draw, but then Cuba is subject to these external forces. So right now, while on the one hand, being the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean close to approving its homemade, domestically produced vaccine, they're also struggling to get syringes to carry out the mass vaccination campaign. And so that's the kind of dichotomy that is created by this feature, that Cuba is a small Caribbean island, which is, you know, in a world dominated by global powers.
Thank you. I realise I'm keeping you guys apart, Par and Helen, so let's keep you both unmuted for now, and let's have a bit more of a chat rather than me sitting in the middle of you both. Par, did you have anything to add to that from a kind of cultural perspective?
Yes, I do. I think I just want to, how do I say this, just balance it a little bit, because one of the things that comes out from the novel, and you know, I'm not spoiling anything, is that sense of frustration. So I think as much as Helen is absolutely right to talk about all of the achievements and the resilience of the Cuban people, many people are, because of that constant having to anticipate what the US government, as it changes, is going to do, many people just get very tired. If you can imagine that constant insecurity on a daily basis, the inability to plan. And the inability of the Cuban government to plan properly as well. It does, of course, do the best it can, and the people do the best they can. But if you can imagine having to budget to put food on the table during the special period, very, very difficult, but still to this day, very difficult because of inefficiencies within the system, but also inefficiencies that are forced from the outside. So I think that's one of the things that comes across really well in the novel, and it comes across with real grace and with humor. And that's one of the gifts that Cuban literature gives us, that it gives us an insight into some of the most kind of objective data that Helen is giving us, but it gives us an insight in an imaginative way where we can feel what everyday life might feel like, rather than the nuts and bolts of a system. So I think I'll leave it there for now, but I've really enjoyed reading the novel. And if I have to say one thing, and it's a question for both Karla and Christina, if I'm allowed to do that, it is, as you can see, Cuba is so overdetermined by its context. You need to know so much about the context in order to understand some quite simple things. How on earth do you deal with that as a writer? And how on earth do you deal with that as a translator? How much do you give the reader? So I can put that in the chat. It's just something that I was curious about as I was reading it, but I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book in its translated version as well.
That's a great question. And Par, I'm actually going to ask you a little bit about specifically Cuban literature. Helen mentions in her book that there was actually a tension that arose in this period between true literature and literary tourism. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's a very, very big story, which I can tell you about as briefly as I can. Because of Cuban writers not being able to publish this colchón editorial, the mattress of unpublished manuscripts, and because actually a lot of Cuban writers were scouted by international scouts from Spain, from the US, many Cuban writers were able to gain one contract or several contracts with foreign press, or win prizes, international prizes for their literature. And the amount of prestige and income that they gained from that set them apart. And it tells us a lot about how literary circuits work in any part of the world. Once, and this is no disrespect to any of the writers, they're all excellent writers, but once you're on that international circuit, it's much easier to then keep working as a writer, whereas many Cuban writers publishing on the island just were simply not able to continue. And many have their own backlog of manuscripts waiting to be published. So the special period and everything that came after it, the sort of delayed effects of that special period, have had a real impact on Cuban literature, what we might understand even by the term Cuban literature, that there are several canons of Cuban literature, which don't necessarily overlap. The other day, if you look on Amazon for Cuban writers, they are few and far between, but the other day I found a book by a dear friend of ours who we've interviewed as part of our research, a Cuban writer still living on the island, who's managed to publish with a foreign publisher and whose book is available on Amazon. And I bought the book and I took a photo and I put it on my Facebook page for him as he asked me to, but he is one in tens of thousands of writers. And that's something that is the result of the literary circuit and the publishing circuit. Some of the things that Helen's been talking about, but specifically related to how literature comes into being. How do the books that we read come into our possession? There's a whole industry behind them, which has to do with authors' rights, with the rights to translation, etc., etc. So I can tell you, you can take it from me, but you can also read my research, that there is a hinterland for us, but actually the core Cuban literary canon is alive and well in Cuba as we speak. But the only way that I, up until now, have been able to bring some of those books back is literally by being in Cuba. They're just not available outside. So it's kind of an invisible canon, or you might think about it as this kind of schizophrenic thing. So I've gone around the houses a little bit, but I'm just delighted to be able to see a work of Cuban literature of this quality being published in the UK and being translated, more importantly, and available in the UK and worldwide. And I wish that I had the time and the energy to make more of those moments happen. It would be a contribution to world culture.
Yeah. Well, Parva, I think we're all going to be running off to read your research after this, so you'll have to let us know where we can read it.
I will put it in the chat.
Helen, did you want something?
Yeah, I wanted to come back on this issue. I mean, one thing I don't think we've articulated here, and often Cuban scholars themselves might not, because it's one of the things that, you know, they perhaps take for granted. Artists in Cuba, certainly before the special period, receive a salary, they receive income. So that frees them up from the need to seek markets in order to sell their work, which means they're freed from the need to commodify their artistic product. The issue that happened with the special period, when state publishing, and by the way, the state has invested a lot in publishing so that the works are heavily subsidized and very affordable to the Cuban people. And that's why you know, that's a key element. One thing is to publish, the second is what price you charge for the product. And that has to be accessible to the population in order to achieve what was certainly an overt objective of the Cuban Revolution, a highly cultured population. So during the special period, when the state doesn't have those resources to invest in its publishing and, you know, cheap and free cheap access to literature, if not free, then the way that artists, as Par says, they are looking to insert themselves into an international market. So the question is, what is required to make their artistic product attractive to that market? So the notion of the real literature versus the literary tourism was there a canon of literature that was maybe highly sexualized portrayals, because then it would have an audience? And I think the same happens in terms of religious practice. There's the argument has been made, this is not my field, so this is not my argument, but that religious practice becomes adapted so that foreigners can pay to participate, and so on and so forth. So this is the question. It's about the commodification of artistic product. And actually this character in the novel, and I'm not going to do a spoiler, but Karla captures that relationship with this Italian character in the novel who is in Cuba looking for Cuban writers. It's just fantastic. It's really, really brilliantly done, Karla.
That's Barbara that you're talking about. Yeah, she's a fascinating character because she lays bare the way that an Italian person in Cuba at that time had access to so much more privilege in certain ways as an outsider, which is of course the opposite of what we usually think when countries sort of have a division between people. That's so fascinating. And I actually want to kind of examine the novel through this lens of, you know, what is Cuban literature and what is tourist literature, because the story is set out very much like a mystery. In fact, there's a great quote on the back from El Mundo. It says, equal parts historical novel, comedy of errors, and detective story. And that's one of the things that makes this book so fascinating. It's so difficult to pin down. And I wonder if this is Karla playing with a reader's expectation of what Cuban literature might be, because it's not overtly political. It's not taking any particular pro or anti-revolutionary stance. And it's kind of, can we see this as true Cuban literature masquerading as literary tourism? How would you think?
I think that's a bit of a risky strategy, to be honest, because I'm not sure what true Cuban literature is. If we're honest about it, Cubans have emigrated from Cuba since 1959, and there is a canon of Cuban literature that has emerged. It has nothing to do with people living on the island. So I would be very wary of saying that there's an authentic Cuban literature and a non-authentic Cuban literature. However, I do completely acknowledge what Helen's saying, that there was a kind of a demand from the outside, from the market, for a particular kind of literature. So what is known as dirty realism. And I'm not going to refer to particular authors, because I think it does a disservice to writers. What it lays bare are the mechanisms of the industry, the literary industry. I don't think it says anything particular about a particular writer. What you've said, however, Heather, about the lack of ability to categorize this work in a particular way, I think that's really fascinating. And that is part and parcel of writing and many other cultural forms within the Cuban Revolution, which are inherently hybrid. So one of the very first kind of policy documents, which you can look up and you can read in English. You can also listen to the original recording, audio recording on YouTube, which is Fidel Castro's Palabras a los Intelectuales, Words to the Intellectuals. And it remains to this day one of the key policy documents. It's been misquoted, it's been misunderstood by lots of people. One of the quotes, one of the sound bites is, everything within the revolution, nothing against the revolution. And that basic principle, that if you continue to write in as many imaginative ways as you think possible, as a writer, using your imagination, that is fine. That is part and parcel of the very, very diverse, pluralistic, and inclusive revolution. There have been times, however, of where for internal reasons, or as we were just saying, for external reasons, a different kind of literature has emerged. Now, in the 1970s, that was literature by some writers that was very much influenced by Soviet socialist realism, a very grey kind of literature by some writers. And as Helen was saying, from the special period onwards, for economic reasons, but also with a very hefty dose of ideology in there, the market demanded a particular view of Cuba. And that was the view of sex, sun, sand, and sex. And so I guess it's just a warning to readers, be careful on Amazon, really be careful. Figure out what you're buying before you go ahead and purchase it. I'm just going to do a little plug. At the University of Nottingham, I know in the UK, we have a collection, a Cuban archive, and that contains lots and lots of Cuban material. So if anybody happens to be in the UK, close to Nottingham, and when we are past the pandemic, you're very welcome to come and visit, because we have probably the biggest collection in Europe of Cuban materials, including newspapers. So that's my plug.
Hey, that might be as close as the summer. You know, if we're being
hopeful,
crossed.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Helen, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I just want to, I feel, you know, like we're at a book launch and I've really got something positive to say about this book. I can't speak about it with the same informed literary approach as Par, because that's not my background, but I thought it was fantastic. And in terms of, you know, where does the literature lie, the novel keeps you on your toes. It's fantastically exciting, it's a mystery, it's evocative of the period. So I really recommend that you all rush off, if you haven't already, and get a copy of this book. And please, Charco, you know, help to diminish the size of the mattress, get some of this Cuban literature published.
I feel like that's probably a good point for us to say thank you to Helen and Par. Thank you so much. That was incredible. We've got a few questions, and I know we're going to translate them both ways. So I'm going to leave a little bit of time for that now. And I'm also going to invite Christina and Carolina back in, and Karla too. I'm going to give everyone a second to unmute. Oh, we've got so many good questions. Thank you so much, guys. I'm actually going to start, and I'm going to actually ask Carolina a question now. Carolina, are you unmuted? Oh, hello. From Barry, he says, Par's fascinating account of the backlog of Cuban literature raises a simple question. Do Charco have plans to publish more Cuban novels?
Well, we certainly do, and everything that Par was saying as well, it's fascinating, and it applies on different levels to Latin American literature in general, but also with Cuba being very particular because it's of its particular contextual scenario. But I'm always trying to go against, and in fact, Charco exists from that idea of trying to go against what arrives into English as a kind of canon of Latin American literature, which to me is it's a misnomer, and I always believe that. So starting from that point, we're trying to deconstruct the idea of the canon in general in any kind of literature, and arriving at those. I don't want to say hidden corners, but the harder to get corners that don't make it to the big publishers, don't make it to the prizes, don't make it to the book festivals, where don't make it to the scouts. So yeah, the question, the answer to the question is yes, definitely. No concrete plans per se. I don't have a lineup of 10 Cuban authors, but certainly the good thing is that I personally have been receiving emails from Cuban authors straight from Cuba saying, I've got this novel, sending it to me. And to me, that's in a way my job being done. It's like I've got a direct channel, and no doubt there'll be more coming for sure. Certainly more from Karla as well.
I think that that speaks to the reputation of Charco. For such a young company, you've done so much. Like, I have a very proud shelf of like all the Charco books in my house, and I'm sure many people here do as well. Martin actually asked, has the novel been published in Cuba? I think it definitely has, yes.
Is that a question for me? That's a question for maybe for Karla, because I'm not sure. We can ask Karla. I know it first came out in Portuguese.
Okay.
I'm not sure it has, so maybe we can ask Karla quickly if she's there. Karla, ¿estás ahí? Preguntan por acá si la novela se publicó en Cuba.
Sí, se publicó. Bueno, primero gracias a todas. He estado aquí sin cámara, pero escuchando. Gracias a todo lo que han dicho, ¿no? La novela esta ha tenido una historia de publicación que parece que sigue el camino de Antonio Meucci, el personaje que fue el motivo de la novela, porque la novela se publicó primero en Portugal, que es donde vivo yo. Hago pausa para traducción.
Thank you. Yeah, so Karla says thank you to this, and she's just saying that first of all, that the publication of the novel has to do with the character of Meucci, who we talked about earlier, and that it was first published in Portugal.
Luego se publicó en Francia, y con la editorial que he publicado todas mis novelas, y luego se pasó como 2 años que no había salido en español, y se publicó en Cuba. finalmente. Y entonces después pasaron otros años y entonces salió en español. Y a partir de ahí ha ido saliendo en otros idiomas, ¿no? Pero decía que seguía mucho el camino, el difícil camino que siguió Antonio Meucci, y la novela está siendo una vez más no se sabe si qué va primero, si la ficción o la realidad. ¿Quién imita a quién, la ficción o la realidad?
Okay, so so after the publication in Portugal, it came out in France, yeah, and then 2 years later after that in Cuba, later in Spain, and it's had a difficult kind of progress because of this idea of Meucci and whether it's fiction, whether it's fact, yeah, sort of just exactly where to place it in terms of genre.
Of course, in that way, it's also similar to another Charco title, Dead Girls, in that it kind of plays with genre and what's real and what isn't. So Charco, really, you're really cementing yourself as this like fascinating place for Latin American writers to be. I'm actually going to put Par's question to Karla now via Carolina, if we can. Her question is, Cuba is so dominated by knowledge of its context and history. How do you deal with that as a writer?
Karla, te cuento. Es una pregunta que te hacía Par, que Cuba está tan dominada por el contexto como sociopolítico general. ¿Cómo como autora sentís eso? ¿Cómo se transfiere eso en tu literatura? Si se transfiere.
Pues sí, claro, se transfiere. Yo empecé a escribir, yo hace 20 años que no vivo en Cuba, que voy, pero no vivo allá. Pero yo empecé a escribir en Cuba y cuando la primera novela que yo escribí, la escribí en Cuba, pero en el momento en que me fui a vivir para Italia. Y es una novela que tiene que ver también con Cuba. Pausa, traducción.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Karla hasn't been in Cuba for 20 years now. She's been away from the country, but she began her first novel while she was still living there and when she was about to move to Italy.
Y a mí me sucedió que cuando vivía ahí en los años 90, yo escribía sobre todo cuentos, no había escrito todavía novela, y escribía cuentos que no tenían nada que ver con la situación, con lo que estábamos viviendo en Cuba. Y esto quizás tenga que ver justamente con cuando estás viviendo una situación que es muy difícil, que de algún modo te está aplastando y te está determinando la vida. Yo escribía sobre otras cosas. Después, cuando me fui a otro contexto, entonces empecé a hablar de Cuba.
Okay.
Pausa, me porto bien.
No, it's okay. All right, so you were in Cuba in the 1990s and Karla was writing short stories then, not to do with the situation that she was going through, because when you're in a difficult situation, you want to think of other things to a certain extent. And so, yeah, so it wasn't until she left Cuba she began to think of those other things.
Y entonces lo que me sucedió fue que luego, cuando empecé a escribir las novelas, en las novelas sí volví a Cuba y volví sobre todo a los años que yo había vivido en Cuba, a los años que yo fui niña en Cuba, como crecí. Y tengo 4 novelas que siempre le llamo mi sinfonía habanera, porque son 4 novelas que los personajes son de La Habana, como yo, y que tratan, son historias de los personajes, pero el contexto histórico siempre tiene que ver con algo particular, importante en ese momento del país. Y son 4 novelas, perdón.
Thank you. Okay, so the novels began when Karla returned to Cuba. Sorry, I've got that wrong. Yeah. No, the novels have to do with Cuba then, and to do with the years of her childhood and adolescence as well. So then she wrote 4 novels, which are set in Havana, and the characters are Havana characters, and also they have to do with the historical context at that time.
Claro, me interesaban grandes temáticas. Una es la familia, la inmigración, el periodo especial, que es Havana Año Cero, y la guerra de Angola, que es algo que marcó varias generaciones en Cuba.
Yeah, so the sort of, thank you, the big kind of themes with this was the family, migration, Year Zero, and also the Angolan War, which you also have a novel about, I think.
Y son novelas que no tienen, son historias completamente distintas, pero tienen un pequeño hilo conductor. Hay personajes secundarios de una que salen en otras. Y era mi manera por eso le llamo mi sinfonía habanera, porque era mi manera de algún modo reconstruir o volver al país donde yo crecí.
Okay, right. So there are different stories going on in Karla's work, but there are secondary characters who appear in different novels, and that's why Karla calls this her symphony in some way. Her writing is a symphony because it's bringing these voices together.
Porque eran además historias que, claro, para mí era importante sacarlas. De escribir es también liberarte, soltar todos los demonios que tienes en la cabeza.
So it was in a way of freeing all the demons that are there in Karla's head. Writing gave that.
Y entonces sí, como es una realidad que realmente, o sea, cuando vives en Cuba estás muy pegado a la realidad, y la realidad determina muchas cosas de tu vida personal.
Okay, all right, so when you're living in Cuba, reality is there before you, it's in front of your face, and that you're trying, ¿qué dijiste al final?
Claro, no te puedes escapar de la realidad, determina muchas cosas de la vida personal.
Right, so that you can't escape from reality, and it determines so many things to do with your private life, your personal life.
Y entonces hasta el momento ya yo he terminado, he cerrado ahora mi sinfonía habanera, ahora estoy digiriendo otras nuevas experiencias.
Okay, so you've finished your symphony. Karla has finished her symphony now, and she's going through new experiences, different life. Okay, thank you.
Amazing, thank you guys. What a great answer to that question. I have a question from, I don't know why I said that so funny. I have a question from Eva for Christina, which kind of follows on from that. She asks, has the cultural specificity of this novel created any extra translation problems for you in the process?
Maybe I'd like to start, that's a really good question, but I think I'd like to start by saying that, just to give a bit of background about myself, and I, in fact, in 1993, when this story is set, went to live in Venezuela, and I was in Venezuela for 10 years. And there's always been an awful lot of communication between Venezuela and Cuba. And also there was a lot of migration from Cuba to Venezuela. So I had Cuban friends in Caracas and things like that. So a lot of the sort of background, historical, cultural context was something I was actually hearing from Latin America rather than from Europe at that time of the Year Zero. And yeah, I mean, I was finding a lot about Caracas as well. So it was a very kind of wide thing. But so I think some of the, say like in terms of language, you know, some of the usage was familiar to me. I mean, I think because at that time, the rhythm of the novel, there was a certain rhythm that felt familiar to me. It wasn't something that I was having to really search for. But having said that, I did have to do a lot of research into, you know, the background, you know, making sure I was very clear about that and getting my facts right. Also, a ton of stuff to do with mathematics. You wouldn't believe it. You know, I always liked maths at school, but gosh, did I have to go back and relearn things and check that I was getting it all right. So in a way, you know, sort of, I think the real sort of challenges came within the research and in just getting that correct rhythm out for, you know, the wonderful voice of Julia and the other characters, finding the difference in their voices as well.
We've actually got a follow-up question, Christina, about the extremely poetic specificity of Cuban cursing. How was that to translate?
Yeah, that is probably, for any translator of Latin American literature working into English, the worst, because English is just, you know, it doesn't have enough curses, it doesn't have enough really good language. So, you know, you're trying to find a way of maybe being inventive, but not, you know, sort of distancing people, imagining that what you think sort of expresses the idea actually communicates itself to your readers as well, and trying not to fall into cliche too much, you know, sort of, but a bit of cliche when it's there. But yeah, I think really, you know, as English speakers, we should all go out and invent more curses.
That's a project I can get on board with. I've got another one for you, Christina. Barry says, I admired your job translating both Havana Year Zero and Eduard Rabasta's Zero-Sum Game. Oh, wow, zero is the word for your books.
Yeah.
One commonality there is Karla's background as an electronics engineer, and Eduardo's as a political scientist. Both authors seem to reflect that through their characters, Julia and Max respectively, who occasionally jump into quite an academic tone, which he says he loves. Were you conscious to reflect that tone in translation?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Barry. Very important, you know, because say in Havana Year Zero, there are points where you're moving within a paragraph, almost within sentences, from a very, you know, idiomatic dialogue into a mathematician speaking, you know, and speaking as a mathematician would speak. And I think the same happened with Eduardo's Zero-Sum Game, which, yeah, is perhaps the most overtly political novel I've translated. And that did involve a lot of sort of working out when he was actually coming from his political sort of masters, you know, sort of the people who have inspired him a great deal, and particularly with Orwell and things like that. So yeah, I think it's being aware of when the tone is changing, when you're moving from the story as it's such to something that the writer wants to say, and that the tone is different. So I hope that answers the question.
I think that was a fantastic answer. And I'm actually going to put a follow-up question to Karla via Carolina, if that's okay. Is this Karla's first time being translated into English? And how did she find the process?
Karla, una pregunta para vos, un poco también para mí, si esta es la primera vez que te han traducido al inglés y cómo fue la experiencia de que te traduzcan al inglés.
Pues sí, es la primera novela traducida al inglés, y había publicado anteriormente 2 cuentos en antologías. Hago pausas para traducción.
Okay. Right, thank you. So this is the first novel that has been translated into English, but before that there were, Karla thinks, 2 stories that were published in translation in anthologies.
Pero y me da, o sea, estoy contentísima, felicísima con esta edición. El trabajo ha sido lindísimo porque primero, bueno, con Carolina trabajamos mucho, trabajamos con la portada, las propuestas de portada, luego con Cristina también, que me mandó, ella conocía bien el español y bien de América Latina y Venezuela y Cuba, pero me hizo preguntas específicas que eran importantes, y entonces estuvimos hablando, y eso es lindísimo.
Okay, so Karla is really super happy with the whole thing, and it's been a beautiful experience. She began talking with Carolina about the cover and other things like that, and then with Christina, that's me, And then it was, more specific questions, and she was very happy with that, which I'm very happy about. Gracias, Karla.
No, y luego hay algo que es hermosísimo en los libros, que mis personajes, estos personajes, gracias a Cristina, pueden expresarse en inglés de manera como yo no soy capaz de expresarme. Y hay siempre esa magia extraña cuando se hace la traducción a otra lengua de tus palabras, que ya no son tus palabras, porque estas son las palabras de Cristina.
Yeah, so it's very beautiful and experience, and most important is to feel that the characters are expressing themselves in English, because Karla feels that's not something she can do herself, all right? And there's a special magic about that whole thing of being able to get those characters into English.
Y que son tus palabras, no son las mías.
Right, then yes, I agree with you. Yes, sí, absolutamente. Yeah, there is my words, but your characters, tus personajes, mis palabras.
We've actually got another question for Karla from Helen. She says, does the music list, so Charco have shared a playlist from Karla, which is, I assume, to be listened to around and not especially at the same time as reading. Does the playlist shared in this chat include the song which is repeatedly cited in the book about Margarita?
Bueno, esto es una pregunta de Helen, Karla, sobre la playlist que creas, ¿no? Sobre la música que vos creás para acompañar la novela, y si ahí figura la canción que tiene relación con Margarita, la novela. Pregunta Helen.
Fíjate que no, a ver, Margarita, yo creo que Margarita no está, porque, claro, te hablo, la playlist en todas mis novelas, hago la banda sonora de las novelas, que son las músicas de cada personaje, y luego músicas que están sonando en determinadas escenas.
Okay, so the playlist, which is there for each novel, is the kind of music that is within the novel, or which is going for each, the sort of general environment about that. Pero Karla, la Margarita no es una.
Y entonces, no, de todos los personajes, termino sobre la banda sonora y ahora hablo de Margarita. Y entonces para mí, yo estudié música en el conservatorio, y para mí la música es fundamental, absolutamente, y es parte de toda mi literatura, porque yo uso la música para escribir, y además me interesa también la música de las palabras y el ritmo de los capítulos y las cadencias de las frases. Es para mí fundamental, y me callo.
Okay.
Silencio en la música.
Yeah. So Karla studied music in the conservatoire, and she's saying that music is fundamental to her work, that she listens to music as she's working, and so it's a very important part of her work. Right.
Y entonces, de todos los personajes de esta novela, Margarita es el único personaje que influye a todos, pero no está, porque Margarita no sale en la novela.
Okay, so of all the characters, Margarita is the one who is there. She influences everybody, but she doesn't actually appear ever in the novel. Yeah.
Pero la música de Margarita no está en esta novela, porque hay una historia en Havana Año Zero sobre unos paquetes con unos casetes de música que le van a llegar a Margarita, que no le llegan nunca a Margarita, y le llegan a un personaje de otra novela. Por eso Margarita es otro de los personajes secundarios que juegan con otra novela.
Okay, so there's Margarita the music of Margarita is not there, because there's a story within the novel about some cassettes which are being taken to Margarita, who is in Brazil then.
Brazil?
Yeah, I think. Okay, and so her music is not actually there within the list.
Entonces, la música de Margarita sale en otra novela.
Okay, it comes out in another novel.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys. I mean, that leaves us with so much to go on with. We have a playlist to go away. We have Karla's other novel to find Margarita in. We've got so much from Par and Helen to look into as well. And I think we could talk about this incredible book all night, but I feel like it's probably time for me to pass over to Carolina to close things out. If you're there.
I'm here. Thank you so much indeed, Heather. I think we could talk about this wonderful novel, which I hope everybody who's here tonight and who's read it has found as wonderful as we have. And thank you, Par, and thank you, Helen, thank you, Christina, thank you, Karla, thank you, Heather, thank you, Jules, and thank you everybody for coming. We're very proud to be, at least we're trying to bring you the best of contemporary Latin American literature to you. And no doubt Karla is out there. She's one of the best and most interesting voices out there, certainly from our region. And I'm going to leave you with our special treat, as we tend to do in our live events, which is a discount code. So get your pens. This is only available for 48 hours, and it's a 20% discount to all our single titles, so no bundles, no tote bags. But here you are. It's Havana 20. Excuse my writing. It's 48 hours. And I'm also going to give you a little surprise, which is a kind of teaser to what's going to come next, or at some point with Charco. And it's this, which is a postcard, as you can see. And it has to do with, again, like Heather said, the wonderful Pablo Font who does our covers. And you're going to be able to buy postcards from us for all the covers that didn't make it to get covers. So this is actually a reject for Holiday Heart, which made it into a postcard. So, but I'll tell you more about that at some point. The main thing is the discount code. Again, it's Havana 20. And it's Pablo cards. Yeah, that's great. And I cannot thank you enough, everybody who made it here tonight. We feel very privileged to have you readers. And again, Heather and Helen and Par and Karla and Christina, very, very grateful to you all. And I'll shut up and leave it to Heather to say bye-bye.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for joining us. Muchas gracias, Karla. Thank you so much, Par and Helen. Thank you so much, Christina, as well. I know it's always difficult to translate on a live event, and you did a brilliant job. Honestly, guys, I'm such a huge fan of Charco Press, and I'm such a huge fan of this book. And you must buy it. You simply must. And you must buy about 10 others while you're there, because they're all fantastic. And thank you to Jules as well, because she's been in the secret host in the background, managing lots of moving parts. So thank you all, and hopefully we will see you for our next launch. Thank you so much, everybody.